The photograph was taken 3 days before she vanished. Look at her face. Really look at it. That's Karen Umphrey, standing at the edge of Clearwater Lake, summer of 1980, her hair catching the last of the golden hour light. She's smiling, but if you study those eyes long enough, you'll see something else hiding behind them. Something that whispers of secrets. Something that screams of fear. For 43 years, this photograph sat in a dusty evidence box in a small-town police station. For 43 years, people whispered her name in the grocery store aisles and fell silent when her mother walked past. For 43 years, everyone in Millbrook, Indiana believed they knew what happened to Karen Umphrey. They were all wrong. What I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about truth, about justice, and about the darkness that can live inside the people you trust most. This is not just a story about a missing girl. This is a story about an entire town that looked away. This is a story about the lies we tell ourselves to sleep at night. And most importantly, this is the story of how one woman refused to let the truth stay buried. Before we go any further, I need you to do something. If you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever been silenced, if you've ever wondered whether anyone would fight for your story, then share this video right now. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear took decades to uncover, and Karen's story deserves to be told. Don't let her fade into forgotten history again. Let me take you back to the summer of 1980, back to a town so small that everyone knew everyone's business, or at least they thought they did. Millbrook was the kind of place where doors stayed unlocked and children rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on. Population 4,017. 1 diner, 2 churches, 3 bars, and more secrets than any small town should rightfully hold. Karen Umphrey was 19 years old. She had just finished her first year at the state university, studying to become a nurse. Her mother, Dorothy, ran the fabric store on Main Street. Her father, Harold, had passed away when she was 12, leaving the 2 women to navigate life together in a house at the end of Maple Lane. Karen was known for her kindness, her sharp wit, and her habit of taking in stray animals that her mother pretended to hate, but secretly fed under the table. That summer, Karen had come home with plans. She was going to work at the Clearwater Lake Resort, save money for her second year of tuition, and spend her evenings studying by the water. Simple plans. Good plans. The kind of plans that 19-year-olds make when they still believe the world is fundamentally fair. The resort was a modest establishment, nothing fancy. A main lodge, a handful of cabins, a small beach, and a dock where teenagers snuck cigarettes and couples watched the sunset. The owner was a man named Vernon Holcomb, 52 years old, respected by the community, married to Eileen, who taught Sunday school at First Methodist. Vernon had owned the resort for 20 years. He was on the town council. He donated to the Little League. He was, by all outward appearances, the kind of man you trust with your daughter. Karen started work on June 2nd. She cleaned cabins, served meals, helped guests with their bags. She was good at her job, the guests adored her, and by all accounts, she was having a good summer. But something changed in late July. Her mother noticed it first. Dorothy would later tell investigators that Karen seemed distracted. She stopped bringing home funny stories about the guests. She started locking her bedroom door at night, something she'd never done before. When Dorothy asked if something was wrong, Karen would smile and say everything was fine, just tired from working long hours. But Dorothy knew her daughter. She knew that smile was a shield. On the night of August 15th, Karen worked the late shift at the lodge. She was scheduled to close up the dining room at 10 and be home by 10:30. The last person to see her was Meredith Crane, another summer worker, who watched Karen get into her blue Chevy Nova in the parking lot. Meredith waved. Karen waved back, and then she drove away into the night. She never made it home. At first, no one panicked. Maybe she'd stopped to see a friend. Maybe she'd pulled over to watch the meteor shower that everyone had been talking about. But when midnight came and Dorothy's calls to the Holcomb residence went unanswered, when the Nova wasn't parked at any of Karen's usual spots, when morning arrived without a word, Dorothy did what any mother would do. She called the police. Sheriff Boyd Garrett arrived at Dorothy's door at 8 in the morning. He was a large man with a slow way of speaking that some mistook for stupidity but was actually careful calculation. He took notes. He asked questions. He promised to find her girl. But even then, even on that first morning, Dorothy noticed something in his eyes. A hesitation. A flicker of something that looked almost like resignation. The search began immediately. Volunteers combed the roads between the resort and Maple Lane. Divers checked the lake, fearing the worst. Dogs were brought in, tracking Karen's scent from the parking lot to a spot on Route 7 where the trail simply vanished. It was as if Karen Umphrey had driven into the darkness and been swallowed whole. Days turned into weeks. The Nova was never found. No body was recovered. No witnesses came forward. The town whispered theories. Maybe she'd run off with a secret boyfriend. Maybe she'd gotten mixed up with drugs at college and owed dangerous people money. Maybe she'd simply wanted to disappear, to start a new life somewhere far from Millbrook. Dorothy Umphrey rejected every theory. Her daughter would never leave without a word. Her daughter would never cause this kind of pain intentionally. Something had happened to Karen. Something terrible. And someone in this town knew exactly what it was. But in Millbrook in 1980, there were some questions that didn't get asked. There were some doors that stayed closed. There were some names that carried too much weight to be spoken alongside words like suspect or investigation. And so, despite Dorothy's pleas, despite her letters to the state police and her desperate calls to anyone who would listen, the case of Karen Umphrey grew cold. The file was never officially closed. It simply stopped being worked. It became one more tragedy in a world full of tragedies, one more unanswered question in a universe indifferent to human suffering. Karen's photograph was moved from the sheriff's desk to a filing cabinet to a box in the basement. The town moved on. The resort stayed open. Vernon Holcomb remained on the town council. And Dorothy Umphrey waited. Time moves differently when you're waiting for answers that never come. Dorothy aged in dog years after Karen's disappearance. Her hair turned gray, then white. Her fabric store stayed open, but she stopped caring whether anyone bought anything. She became the ghost of her former self, haunting her own life, trapped between hope and acceptance, unable to commit to either. But Dorothy was not idle. Every year, on August 15th, she would walk into the sheriff's office and ask about her daughter's case. Every year, she would receive the same sympathetic smile and the same hollow promises. Every year, she would leave more convinced than ever that something in Millbrook was deeply, fundamentally wrong. She kept a journal. This detail is important, so remember it. Dorothy Umphrey documented everything. Every conversation, every suspicion, every tiny inconsistency that caught her attention over the decades. The journal eventually filled 11 volumes. 11 volumes of a mother's refusal to forget. In these pages, she recorded something that the official investigation had overlooked or perhaps intentionally ignored. 3 other young women who had worked at the Clearwater Lake resort over the years had experienced troubling encounters with Vernon Holcomb. One had quit suddenly in 1976 and moved out of state. Another had mentioned to a friend that Vernon made her uncomfortable but never specified why. The third had simply stopped showing up to work one day in 1978, leaving Millbrook without explanation. Dorothy tracked down 2 of these women. The conversations were brief and painful. Neither wanted to discuss Vernon Holcomb. Neither wanted to remember their time at the resort. But both said the same thing before hanging up the phone. "Be careful, Mrs. Umphrey. Some powerful people don't like questions." Dorothy continued asking questions anyway. She learned that Vernon Holcomb was not just a businessman and town council member. He was the largest donor to Sheriff Garrett's election campaigns. He was a hunting buddy of the county prosecutor. He was a member of the same fraternal lodge as the mayor, the bank president, and 3 of the 5 town council members. Vernon Holcomb was connected to every lever of power in Millbrook, and those levers did not move against their own. What Dorothy couldn't understand was why. What was Vernon Holcomb hiding that warranted such protection? What had he done that required an entire town's complicity? The answer, when it finally came, would be more horrifying than she could have imagined. In 1987, 7 years after Karen's disappearance, Dorothy received an anonymous letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, postmarked from a town 300 miles away. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 6 words typed in the center. She tried to tell them. Cabin 9. Dorothy read those words 100 times. She dreamed about them. She spent 3 months trying to understand what they meant. Cabin 9 was one of the guest accommodations at the resort, the most secluded one, set back from the others at the edge of the property. She tried to tell them. Who was she? What did she try to tell? And who was them? Dorothy took the letter to Sheriff Garrett. He examined it, nodded thoughtfully, and promised to look into it. 2 weeks later, he called Dorothy to inform her that they had been unable to trace the letter's origin and that it was probably the work of a crank or someone seeking attention. The investigation remained unchanged. The file stayed in the basement. But Dorothy noticed something in that meeting with the sheriff. Something in the way his eyes moved when she mentioned Cabin 9. Something that looked like recognition. Something that looked like fear. She began to watch Vernon Holcomb more carefully after that. She watched him at town events, at church, at the diner where he ate breakfast every Wednesday morning. She watched the way he smiled at young women, the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long, the way his hand found reasons to touch shoulders and backs and arms. She watched, and she documented, and she waited. Years passed. The world changed around Millbrook, while Millbrook itself stayed frozen in time. Vernon Holcomb retired from the town council in 1992. Sheriff Garrett died of a heart attack in 1995 and was replaced by his deputy, a man named Frank Morrison who knew even less about Karen's case than his predecessor. The Clearwater Lake resort passed from Vernon to his son, Leonard, who modernized it and rebranded it as a destination wedding venue. Dorothy was 73 years old in 2001 when she was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. The doctors gave her 18 months. She told them they didn't understand. She couldn't die yet. There was still work to be done. She began to organize her journals. 11 volumes of observations, suspicions, and questions, all carefully indexed and cross-referenced. She made copies of everything. She stored them in 3 different locations. She wrote a letter to be opened upon her death. And then Dorothy Umphrey did something that changed everything. She reached out to a journalist. His name was Marcus Webb, and he worked for a regional newspaper known for investigative reporting. Dorothy had read one of his articles about a cold case from a neighboring county, a story about a young boy who had disappeared in 1969 and whose remains had been discovered 3 decades later. Marcus had spent 2 years on that story. He had uncovered corruption in the local police department. He had brought a family closure after 30 years of waiting. Dorothy called his office on a Tuesday morning. The secretary tried to take a message, but Dorothy refused to leave one. She called back every hour for 3 days until Marcus finally picked up the phone himself, probably just to make the call stop. The conversation lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, Marcus Webb understood that he had stumbled onto something significant. The patterns Dorothy had identified, the connections she had documented, the questions that had never been asked, they all pointed toward a truth that someone had worked very hard to keep buried. Marcus began his investigation in secret. He obtained the original case file through a public records request. He tracked down the former resort employees Dorothy had spoken with and convinced 2 of them to speak on the record. He examined Vernon Holcomb's business dealings, his charitable contributions, his political connections. What he found was a web. Vernon Holcomb had spent 40 years cultivating relationships that protected him from scrutiny. He had donated to the right campaigns, joined the right organizations, befriended the right people. He had built himself an impenetrable fortress of social capital. And according to multiple sources who spoke to Marcus on condition of anonymity, he had used that fortress to hide predatory behavior that spanned decades. Karen Umphrey, Marcus began to believe, had not simply disappeared. She had become a threat. Have you ever wondered what you would do if you discovered that someone you trusted had done something unforgivable? I want you to stop and really think about that. Would you have the courage to speak up, knowing that speaking up might destroy you? Would you fight for justice even when the system was designed to protect the guilty? Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think you would do. Marcus Webb's investigation took 3 years. 3 years of interviews conducted in parking lots and coffee shops, away from Millbrook's watchful eyes. 3 years of documents obtained through legal channels and some obtained through channels that existed in grayer areas. 3 years of piecing together a puzzle that had been deliberately scattered. During this time, Dorothy Umphrey defied her doctor's predictions. The cancer went into remission, then returned, then went into remission again. She told Marcus it was stubbornness. Her body knew it couldn't quit until Karen had justice. The picture that emerged from Marcus's investigation was devastating. Vernon Holcomb had been assaulting young women who worked at his resort for at least 15 years before Karen Umphrey became his employee. The pattern was always the same. He targeted women who were young, often from struggling families, always in positions where they needed the job and couldn't afford to make waves. He used his power over their employment to isolate them, to test their boundaries, to groom them for what came next. When victims tried to speak up, they found themselves silenced. Some were fired for invented infractions. Some were threatened with legal action for slander. Some simply left town, too traumatized or too afraid to fight. And always, the institutions that should have protected them looked the other way. The sheriff's department knew. Marcus found evidence that at least 2 formal complaints had been filed against Vernon Holcomb over the years, complaints that had been investigated by sympathetic officers and dismissed without action. The town council knew. Minutes from closed-door sessions contained references to concerns about resort operations that were quickly tabled and never revisited. The church knew. A former pastor, now deceased, had reportedly confronted Vernon about rumors, only to find himself reassigned to a distant congregation 6 months later. Everyone knew, and everyone chose silence. Karen Umphrey's fatal mistake was choosing to speak. Through a painstaking reconstruction of events, Marcus determined that Karen had witnessed something in late July 1980 that she could not ignore. A young woman named Patricia Hendricks, 15 years old, working at the resort illegally to help support her family. Patricia had been cornered by Vernon Holcomb in Cabin 9. Karen had intervened. What happened next was never fully documented, but the aftermath was clear. Patricia Hendricks left Millbrook the next day and never returned. Her family claimed she had gone to stay with relatives. No one asked follow-up questions. No one checked on her welfare. But Karen, according to sources who later spoke to Marcus, refused to stay quiet. She had confronted Vernon directly. She had threatened to go to the police, not the local police, but the state police, bypassing the network of protection that kept Vernon safe. She had made phone calls to numbers in the state capital. She had started keeping records. And then, on August 15th, she disappeared. The official investigation had treated Karen as a probable runaway or accident victim. But Marcus discovered that the investigation had been compromised from the start. Sheriff Garrett had been contacted by Vernon Holcomb within hours of Dorothy's initial missing person report. Phone records, obtained through sources Marcus would never identify, showed multiple calls between Garrett and Holcomb in the days following Karen's disappearance. The dive search of the lake had been cursory at best. The dogs had been called off before they could follow the trail to its end. Someone had made Karen Umphrey disappear, and someone had made sure she stayed disappeared. Marcus presented his preliminary findings to Dorothy in the spring of 2005. She sat in her living room, the journals spread around her, and listened as he laid out what he had discovered. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something Marcus would never forget. "I always knew. I just needed someone else to see it too. But knowledge and proof are different things." Marcus had a compelling narrative, supported by circumstantial evidence and testimony from sources who were terrified to go public. What he did not have was physical evidence. He did not have Karen's body. He did not have the Nova. He did not have anything that would definitively connect Vernon Holcomb to whatever had happened that night. And Vernon Holcomb, now 80 years old and living in a comfortable retirement at his son's renovated resort, was still protected by the same network of complicity that had shielded him for decades. Frank Morrison, the current sheriff, was Boyd Garrett's protege. The county prosecutor still owed Vernon favors from campaigns past. The town still closed ranks around its own. Marcus published his story anyway. The article ran in the regional newspaper on the 25th anniversary of Karen's disappearance, August 15, 2005. It was careful, legal, hedged with phrases like alleged and according to sources. But the implications were unmistakable. The article accused the Millbrook power structure of protecting a predator and covering up a likely murder. The response was immediate and fierce. Vernon Holcomb's lawyers filed a defamation lawsuit within 48 hours. The newspaper stood behind Marcus, but the legal battle would eventually drain their resources and force a settlement that included a published clarification. Several of Marcus's sources recanted their statements, claiming they had been misquoted or misunderstood. The sheriff's department announced it would investigate the allegations and promptly declared, 2 months later, that there was no credible evidence of misconduct. In Millbrook, the wagons circled one final time. Marcus Webb left journalism in 2007, burned out and disillusioned. He moved to Colorado, took a job teaching at a community college, and tried to forget about Karen Umphrey. But Karen's story wouldn't let him go. He still had copies of everything. He still had interviews that had never been published. He still had questions without answers. And somewhere in his files, he had a small detail that he had never been able to make sense of. One of his sources, a woman who had worked at the resort in the late 1970s, had mentioned a structure on the property that no longer existed. A storage building behind Cabin 9. A place where, according to this source, Vernon Holcomb kept things he didn't want found. The building had been demolished in 1985, 5 years after Karen's disappearance. The land had been graded and turned into a parking area for the wedding venue. Whatever had been kept in that building was now buried under asphalt and gravel. Or was it? Dorothy Umphrey died on March 3, 2012, at the age of 84. She had outlived her doctor's predictions by more than a decade. She had outlived Boyd Garrett and Vernon Holcomb, who had passed away peacefully in his sleep in 2010, never having faced any consequences for his actions. She had outlived most of the people who had conspired to keep her daughter's fate a secret. But she had not outlived her hope for justice. Her funeral was small, attended mostly by people who remembered Karen and felt some residual guilt for how the investigation had been handled. Marcus Webb flew in from Colorado. He sat in the back row and watched as a woman he had come to admire was lowered into the ground next to a daughter she had never been able to bury. After the service, Dorothy's lawyer approached Marcus with an envelope. Inside was a letter Dorothy had written, along with a key. The letter instructed Marcus to visit a storage unit in a town 20 miles from Millbrook. Dorothy had rented it under a false name 30 years earlier. She had been paying for it ever since. Inside the unit, Marcus found boxes. Dozens of boxes, carefully labeled and organized. The journals, of course, but also photographs, documents, audio recordings on cassette tapes, some of them interviews Dorothy had conducted on her own, interviews she had never told Marcus about. And in the back of the unit, wrapped in plastic sheeting, was something that made Marcus's heart stop. A license plate. Indiana, 1980. The registration number matched Karen Umphrey's blue Chevy Nova. Dorothy's letter explained. In 1986, an anonymous source had contacted her, someone who had been involved in disposing of evidence after Karen's disappearance, someone whose conscience had finally become unbearable. This source had given Dorothy the license plate along with a hand-drawn map. The map showed a location in the forest outside Millbrook, a location that Dorothy had never been able to investigate because it was on private property owned, at the time, by Vernon Holcomb. Dorothy had spent 26 years waiting for the right moment to use this information, waiting for Vernon Holcomb to die, waiting for the statute of limitations on obstruction of justice to expire for the people who had helped cover up the crime, waiting for Marcus Webb to be ready to finish what they had started. The moment was now. Marcus returned to journalism with a vengeance. He partnered with a true crime podcast that had built a following by reinvestigating cold cases. Together, they launched a year-long investigation into Karen Umphrey's disappearance, using Dorothy's archives as their foundation. The podcast episodes released monthly, each one building on the last. The public response was overwhelming. Listeners from across the country became obsessed with Karen's story. They analyzed the evidence. They researched the people involved. They created timelines and theories and forums dedicated to solving the case. And slowly, under the pressure of this unprecedented public attention, the walls around Millbrook began to crack. New witnesses came forward. People who had been too afraid to speak in 1980, in 2005, found courage in anonymity. They called the podcast's tip line. They emailed encrypted messages. They confirmed details that Marcus had only been able to speculate about before. One caller, an elderly woman who refused to give her name, provided the final piece of the puzzle. She had been a maid at the Clearwater Lake Resort in 1980. On the night of August 15th, she had seen Vernon Holcomb's truck driving away from the property at nearly midnight, hours after the resort was closed. In the truck bed, covered with a tarp, was something large and heavy, something approximately the size of a person. She had told Sheriff Boyd Garrett about this the next day. He had thanked her for the information and told her she must have been mistaken. He had also suggested that her job might be in jeopardy if she mentioned it to anyone else. She had kept the secret for 40 years. She was 91 years old now, and she was tired of carrying it. The podcast episode featuring this testimony went viral. Within a week, it had been downloaded over 5 million times. The national media picked up the story. Suddenly, Karen Umphrey was no longer a forgotten girl from a forgotten town. She was a symbol of every victim who had been silenced, every family who had been denied justice, every community that had chosen complicity over courage. The pressure became too great to ignore. In 2016, the Indiana State Police announced that they were reopening the investigation into Karen Umphrey's disappearance. A new generation of detectives, untainted by the connections that had corrupted the original investigation, would review all available evidence. Ground-penetrating radar technology, unavailable in 1980, would be used to search areas of interest, including the location marked on Dorothy's map. The search team arrived at the forest site on a cold morning in November 2016. The property had changed hands multiple times since 1980. The current owner, a developer who had purchased it for future construction, had granted permission for the search after being convinced that it would be easier to cooperate than to fight a legal battle in the court of public opinion. Marcus Webb was there as an observer. So were reporters from 3 major newspapers, 2 television networks, and the podcast team that had helped resurrect the case. The media presence was unprecedented for a cold case investigation. The ground-penetrating radar identified an anomaly approximately 200 yards from where the old storage building had stood. Something was buried there, something dense and distinct from the surrounding soil. The excavation took 3 days. On the 3rd day, at 4:47 in the afternoon, one of the investigators called for the dig to stop. His voice was quiet but unmistakable. "We found something." What they found was a 1980 blue Chevy Nova, buried in a pit that had been dug and filled decades ago. The car had been crushed, presumably to make it easier to conceal, but it was still identifiable by its VIN number. Inside the car, in what remained of the trunk, were human remains. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. They had found Karen Umphrey. The forensic examination took months. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull. Karen had been struck from behind with a heavy object, likely a hammer or similar tool. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. She had been 19 years old. She had wanted to be a nurse. She had made the mistake of standing up for a frightened 15-year-old girl, and she had paid for that courage with her life. The investigation moved quickly now that there was physical evidence. Vernon Holcomb was dead and beyond prosecution, but others who had helped conceal the crime were still alive. And the forensic evidence pointed to at least 2 additional participants in the cover-up. One was Boyd Garrett, also deceased, but the other was very much alive. Leonard Holcomb, Vernon's son, had been 24 years old in 1980. He had worked alongside his father at the resort, and according to the forensic reconstruction, he had been the one who drove the truck that transported Karen's body. The soil analysis matched his fingerprints, still preserved on fragments of the car after all these years, to the pit where the Nova had been buried. Leonard had not killed Karen. That terrible distinction belonged to his father, but Leonard had helped hide the crime. He had spent 40 years lying to investigators, to journalists, to his own wife and children. He had built his life on a foundation of his father's murder. The arrest was made on national television. Leonard Holcomb, now 60 years old, was led from his home in handcuffs while cameras broadcast every second. The charges included accessory to murder after the fact, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to conceal a homicide. He pleaded not guilty. His lawyers mounted every defense available. They challenged the chain of evidence, questioned the reliability of 40-year-old forensics, attacked Marcus Webb's credibility as a journalist. But the evidence was overwhelming. The fingerprints, the soil analysis, the testimony of witnesses who had finally found their courage. The paper trail that showed suspicious financial transfers between Vernon Holcomb and Boyd Garrett's family over the years. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Leonard Holcomb was sentenced to 25 years in prison. At 60 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. He would die behind bars, just as his father should have. But justice, real justice, is never just about punishment. The aftermath of the conviction transformed Millbrook. The old guard, the network of complicity that had protected Vernon Holcomb for so long, collapsed under the weight of public scrutiny. Frank Morrison, the sheriff who had inherited his predecessor's corruption along with his badge, resigned before he could be forced out. 3 town council members faced ethics investigations. The county prosecutor who had looked the other way for years was disbarred. New leaders emerged, people who had been too young or too powerless to challenge the old system. They began the slow work of rebuilding trust between the community and the institutions that had failed Karen Umphrey. The Clearwater Lake resort was sold and demolished. In its place, a developer built affordable housing for families struggling to find homes in the area. One of the streets was named Karen Umphrey Way. But the most important transformation happened in the hearts of the people who had stayed silent. One by one, they began to speak. Women who had been victimized by Vernon Holcomb decades ago came forward to tell their stories. They were believed now. They were supported. They found community with each other, a sisterhood of survivors who had been alone for too long. Families who had known something was wrong, but had been too afraid to act reached out to Dorothy's remaining relatives to apologize. Some of these conversations were awkward and painful. Some of them led to genuine reconciliation. All of them were necessary. Patricia Hendricks, the 15-year-old girl Karen had protected in 1980, was found living in Oregon. She was 52 years old now, a grandmother, still carrying the trauma of what had happened to her and the guilt of knowing that Karen had died because of her. The podcast team arranged a meeting between Patricia and Karen's remaining family. It was the first time Patricia had been able to speak about that night in Cabin 9 with people who truly understood. She told them everything. How Vernon Holcomb had cornered her. How Karen had burst in, had physically put herself between Patricia and her attacker, had told Vernon that if he touched this girl again, she would make sure everyone in Indiana knew what kind of man he really was. Vernon had laughed and walked away. But Karen had known that wasn't the end. She had started making calls the next day. She had started keeping records. She had refused to back down. She died a hero, Patricia told Karen's family through tears. She saved my life that night, and I've spent 40 years trying to figure out how to honor that. Now you can tell people, they told her. Now you can help make sure this never happens again. And she did. Marcus Webb wrote a book about Karen Umphrey. It was published 3 years after the conviction, after all the appeals had failed and Leonard Holcomb had begun serving his sentence. The book was dedicated to Dorothy Umphrey, who never stopped believing. The book became a bestseller. It was optioned for a documentary, then a feature film. Karen's story, which had been buried for so long, was now known around the world. But Marcus always insisted that the story wasn't really about Karen. It was about the system that allowed Vernon Holcomb to exist. It was about the choices made by dozens of people over decades, choices to stay silent, to look away, to prioritize comfort over conscience. It was about how evil flourishes when good people decide that fighting it is someone else's responsibility. And it was about how one mother refused to accept that. Dorothy Umphrey never got to see justice served for her daughter. She died 4 years before Karen's body was found. But Marcus believed, with something approaching religious conviction, that Dorothy's spirit had guided the investigation from beyond the grave. That her journals, her maps, her decades of patient documentation had made the ultimate resolution possible. She did the work, Marcus said in interviews. All I did was follow the trail she left. The documentary that followed the book ended with footage from Dorothy's journals. Her handwriting, careful and precise, filling page after page with observations and theories and questions. Her voice, recorded on one of the cassette tapes she had made, describing the night Karen was born, the joy she had felt holding her daughter for the first time, the dreams she had for Karen's future. "I will never stop looking for you," Dorothy's voice said over images of Clearwater Lake at sunset. "Even when I'm gone, I will find a way to bring you home." And she had. Karen Umphrey was finally buried properly in the spring of 2017. The ceremony was held at the Millbrook Cemetery, next to her mother and father. Hundreds of people attended, most of them strangers who had been touched by her story. They brought flowers and letters and photographs. They stood in silence as her casket was lowered into the ground. The headstone read, "Karen Elizabeth Umphrey, 1961 to 1980, beloved daughter, courageous soul, finally home." But the story doesn't end there. 3 years after Karen's burial, a young woman named Sarah Chun moved to Millbrook. Sarah was a social worker, fresh out of graduate school, idealistic and determined. She had heard about Karen's story from the documentary and had felt called to do something meaningful with her life. When she learned that Millbrook was looking for someone to run a new crisis center for survivors of assault and abuse, she applied immediately. She got the job. The center was located in a renovated building on Main Street, just 2 doors down from where Dorothy Umphrey's fabric store had once stood. It was named the Karen Umphrey Center for Survivors. The funding came from a combination of state grants, private donations, and a significant contribution from the settlement Marcus Webb's newspaper had received after the defamation lawsuit was ultimately reversed on appeal. Sarah threw herself into the work. She trained volunteers. She established partnerships with law enforcement agencies that had learned hard lessons from the Holcomb case about the importance of believing victims. She created programs that reached into schools and community centers, teaching young people to recognize abuse and speak up. And she made it her personal mission to never let another Karen Umphrey slip through the cracks. The center's first major case came 6 months after it opened. A teenage girl from a neighboring town had been assaulted by a family friend, a man with connections to local government. The girl's family had tried to report the assault, but they were getting the runaround from investigators who seemed reluctant to pursue the case. Sarah knew this story. She had read about it in Dorothy's journals, seen its echo in Vernon Holcomb's decades of impunity. She knew exactly what was happening and exactly what needed to be done. She contacted Marcus Webb, who still maintained connections with journalists around the country. She reached out to advocacy organizations. She made noise. She refused to let the case be quietly buried. The investigation that followed was thorough and uncompromised. The perpetrator was arrested, tried, and convicted. The officials who had tried to obstruct justice were held accountable. The system, for once, worked the way it was supposed to. When it was over, the teenage girl and her family came to the Karen Umphrey Center to thank Sarah personally. The girl was shaking, still processing everything that had happened, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Hope. You saved me," she told Sarah. "You believed me when no one else would." Sarah shook her head. "I didn't save you. A woman named Karen Umphrey saved you 40 years ago. I'm just carrying on her work." The girl didn't fully understand what Sarah meant. But one day she would. One day she would learn about Karen's story, about Dorothy's fight, about the long chain of courage that stretched from 1980 to the present. And maybe, when she was older, she would add her own link to that chain. That's how change happens. Not in grand gestures or single moments of triumph, but in the accumulated weight of individual choices. The choice to speak when silence is easier. The choice to fight when surrender is simpler. The choice to believe that truth matters, even when lies are more convenient. Dorothy Umphrey made that choice every day for 32 years. Marcus Webb made it when he picked up the phone and listened to a grieving mother's story. Patricia Hendricks made it when she finally told the world what Karen had done for her. Sarah Chun made it when she moved to a town with a dark history and decided to help write a brighter future. And now, you have a choice too. You've heard Karen's story. You know what happened to her, what was done to cover it up, what it took to bring the truth to light. You know that there are Karen Umpphreys everywhere, in every town, in every community, silenced and forgotten, because speaking up is dangerous and looking away is easy. What will you do with that knowledge? Will you be the one who speaks up when you see something wrong? Will you be the one who believes victims when they're told they must be mistaken? Will you be the one who challenges systems designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable? Karen Umphrey's legacy isn't just about what happened in 1980. It's about what happens every day, in every place where someone has to choose between courage and complicity. Her story doesn't have to repeat. The cycle can be broken, but only if we break it. In Millbrook today, there's a mural on the wall of the Karen Umphrey Center. It shows Karen as she was in that final photograph, standing at the edge of Clearwater Lake, her hair catching the golden light. But in the mural, she's not alone. Standing beside her, painted in vibrant colors, are all the people whose lives she touched. Dorothy, Patricia, Marcus, Sarah, and dozens of others, known and unknown, whose paths crossed with her story. Below the mural, in letters that visitors sometimes stop to photograph, is a single sentence. She spoke up. Now we carry her voice forward. And every day, in that small town that once buried its secrets so deep, people prove that the sentence is true. They speak up. They carry the voice forward. They ensure that Karen Umphrey, who died at 19 trying to protect an innocent girl, did not die in vain. The photograph from 1980 still exists. You can see it in the documentary, in the museum exhibit that travels to universities around the country, on the cover of Marcus Webb's book. Karen Umphrey, standing at the edge of the lake, smiling that smile that hides something behind it. But now, when people look at that photograph, they don't just see fear. They see courage. They see defiance. They see a young woman who looked at injustice and refused to accept it, even though refusal cost her everything. And they see a reminder that every one of us, every day, faces the same choice she faced. The choice to stay silent or to speak. The choice to look away or to look closer. The choice to let evil win or to fight back, however we can, for however long it takes. Dorothy Umphrey fought for 32 years. Marcus Webb fought for 15. Patricia Hendricks fought for 40. Sarah Chun is fighting still. How long will you fight? Karen Umphrey's story didn't end in 1980. It didn't end with the conviction or the burial or the center that bears her name. Her story continues every time someone chooses courage over convenience. Every time someone believes a victim. Every time someone refuses to let the truth stay buried. And now her story lives in you. What you do with it is up to you. But remember, Dorothy Umphrey never stopped believing that justice would come. She was right. It just took time. It took patience. It took an army of people who refused to forget. Karen came home. After 43 years in the darkness, she came home. And she brought the light with her.